I'm with Jessie Dunleavy. Jess is the author of this book. I hope people can see it and it's not backwards or upside down or something like. Is it mirrored for you?
No, I can read it. I can't
Okay,
see
good.
the whole cover, but I can read it. It's good enough.
I've got that mirror image where if I go left, it's right, and I'm dyslexic. So, Cover My Dreams in Ink, and it was it's a book that's would you call it a memoir? I guess about about you and your son. I mean, I know that it's a book. Largely, I feel like your son's the protagonist of the book, and you're the narrator of the book, and maybe you're like a joint protagonist, and it's this wonderful interplay.
It's from my perspective because it can't be from anybody else's perspective, but it's focused on either him or my interactions with him. And believe me, there's plenty that people he met in other places could tell you that he did that I wouldn't have any way of knowing, just like any relationship. And as I said in the very beginning, he could have written his own book about me too.
Hmm.
So in a way, you feel guilty telling somebody's story because you think you're not here to contribute to this or to correct me. And I'm just plowing ahead. And that felt presumptuous in a way. But all you can say is he knew me too. And he did.
Paul, I'll get this part out of the way. Paul passed away from a fatal overdose. And so it's this like the overtones created by virtue of that fact, or just like that you inserted humor in a way, and just wit and humor. And some of it was just reflecting on Paul's own wit and humor. And then there are these interactions, you would bring them to a meta level sometimes. And, you'd say, these are the interactions, and you're kind of like, it's a screen and you're watching it. And then you'd have something to say about the interaction. And it was either I'm crying, or I'm laughing at something, or I'm just involved in it, or wondering what is going to happen next. But some keynotes, which are relevant and very real, that I pulled out, and you might add something, and of course it's your book, and I want you to talk about it, are that, Paul died, and he probably shouldn't have, and I don't mean shouldn't have, like obviously shouldn't have, and nobody would want, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean? That
I know exactly what you mean.
You could see in retrospect the things in which would have prevented it. And it's difficult to pin that on a single person, but you do have a collection of stories that build a prologue about Paul's life and what it, he's a human being who works with contingencies. He makes choices for himself. And at the same time, he fell into better and worse moral luck. And some of that luck and bad luck and misfortune came from an education system or medical systems, policing systems that, when those structures that are in place, you have to be grateful for in some sense. And on the other hand, they can become sociopathic when they've run away. So I guess given all that, where would you like to start? I want to run through the book proper, and I'd like you to get the message out to the extent that you can. And I'd like to ask questions along the way, but I would love to give you the first shot at starting us somewhere.
Well, I'm going to start with this because of what you just said, and then can go in different directions. But Paul was he was a victim of systems more than he was of individuals. Even though there were some individuals that didn't serve us well, and that I have on my list of individuals that didn't serve us well, we met a lot of good people along the way too. But that wasn't enough because the systems were so flawed. And so I never want to say, oh, everybody we encountered didn't care for us and, just turned a blind eye to our struggling. That was true sometimes, but mostly it was systems. And so that's what I would like to see people pay more attention to. And I think some people go into a line of work absolutely with the idea that they will help people. And the system works against them too, in a way. So I don't really pretend to know all of that, but it can happen to people. And so that he was a victim for sure. And he was victimized in the first place, if victimized is the right word, just by getting dealt a shorthand coming out of the gate. He had disabilities, and he had disabilities that weren't noticeable on the surface, but that really held him back from any kind of success and connections, meaningful connections with others. So he was handicapped. And so that was not of any systems making, that was just the way he came into the world. And then it was hard to get the help that we needed.
You say he was handicapped. How so?
He had learning disabilities, I guess would be the most global way to present it, because he did. But it wasn't just your typical LD child who needs a different approach to reading or to learning certain mathematical processes. It was that he was attentionally impaired, and he had some of those other differences that you associate with learning disabled. Like he flipped his letters and he did everything backwards. And I do too. You just said you're dyslexic, and I thought, yeah, I knew I liked you. Because I am too. I'll be in the car and somebody says, turn right. And I think I panic for a split second. I think, don't just say go that way.
I should be above board in saying that I use that as a colloquialism. I probably could easily get the diagnosis of dyslexia, but I've never been actually diagnosed with it.
Me either, but I'll write down a phone number and I flip the last two numbers. When I'm reading, sometimes I'll read the wrong word because I know I've jumbled the letters. I can't spell to save my life. And so Paul had some of those disabilities too, but his were so much worse because of his attentional impairment. So when he was in a 3-year-old program, the teacher said to me, he doesn't take his turn when he's prompted. And I wasn't too worried about him. I just thought he was the sweetest, cutest thing. And I said, oh, I guess he's immature for his age. And she said, no, but we'll all go in a circle and we'll say a word and they'll sing a song and they'll insert the word that each child came up with. And he wouldn't say a word because he didn't really know he was being addressed. So she said, I'm concerned about him. And I didn't worry, but the next year the teacher said, he doesn't even join in with the others when it's time to get up from the table and go sit on the floor. He stays at the table. You have to tap him on the arm or walk with him. And I did know that from living with him because he was that way at home. And sometimes, you could put your hands on either side of his face and have him look you in the eye and say, where'd you put your shoes? He didn't know you were talking to him. So he wasn't obstinate. He wasn't defiant. He didn't know you were talking to him. And then he'd come back. And when he'd come back, he would say, what did you say? And I'd say, I want to know where you put your shoes. Oh, I put them under the sofa. So he didn't know. My take was that he had gone away for a little while.
Where do you think, looking back on it, if you can, he's 3 years old, right? Where do you think he was?
3 or 4.
Where was he going in his mind, did you think?
I swear, I thought at the time, and I really don't know, that it was a blank slate. I think he just tuned out. Then again, I don't know. And he didn't seem to know. So it suggested some kind of seizures. And so I had him tested for that multiple times, and there was no seizure activity. And, different doctors, and I took him to some of the best doctors around, and there was never a label. One doctor said when he was maybe 11 that it was he thought some sort of not damage, but some sort of a flaw in the central nervous system. It was, even these neurologists and these well-known people didn't have a label. But I wasn't hammering away for that. I wanted to know where to put him in school and how to teach him and what to do for him.
Right.
And so it wasn't as though if it came with a name, it was going to be fixed. So I just kept striving for the right school and the right set of professionals. And some of them tried hard and were good. And the doctor I took him to when he was in first grade, I didn't feel like I'd ever be lucky enough to get to see somebody of her caliber. And I did. And she told me that his visual perception was 99th percentile, but that he had no way to express that because he had a hand tremor. So that gift that he had, he couldn't share because he had no control over a pencil or a pen. And that was dramatic. You could not read what he wrote. And so he was disadvantaged in that way. And then this same doctor tested him years down the road, and she said, he had language impairment. She did identify that. So that was part of the constellation of issues that he had. So he had the hand tremor, the attentional impairment, and the language impairment. And what that meant for him is that it was hard for him to retrieve a word and to fast enough and put it in a sentence in order to join in the conversation, because everybody's going back and forth so quickly. So he'd have thoughts, but he wouldn't be able to contribute his thoughts because that retrieval process was slow. And so she did tell me, she said, it's got to be massively frustrating to be him because he cannot let you know what his good visual perception has to offer or what his good thought process has to offer. So, but he didn't know any different. And he was sweet-natured, and he would get engaged in things. I mean, he would play with blocks because he couldn't draw. I realize now that putting things together was a favorite pastime because that was drawing on his visual perception, and it wasn't so much what school tapped into, but it would engage him. And
it's a proxy for drawing.
Games like Othello, he beat me every time. And so there were things he was good at when he was paying attention. But so he was, and he changed schools a lot. And he began to put it together. At first he didn't, because he wasn't very self-centered. And I think sometimes you can't afford to be self-centered when nothing comes easy to you. You know what I mean? I've noticed kids, and you work with kids, and I did too for a long time. The kids for whom everything is coming up roses, they're just gifted in terms of what school asks for. They're early readers, the math just comes naturally to them, they love it, they're athletic, everything's golden. Well, I've always thought, and it's not like a vendetta, but adulthood's going to deal you some blows that you may not be as well equipped to deal with as the person who had a few, ego insults along the way, or a few deficits that they had to compensate for and work around,
for sure,
or a few hardships. And especially these days, and I was in the education field long enough to see it change, that parents are so protective of their children. They don't want them to be disappointed. They don't want them to get a bad grade. They don't want them to be excluded from somebody's birthday party. The whole hovering has made that phenomenon worse. So here you have a gifted child, and then you're going to make them your full-time job. This is very bad coming together. Let the child experience some setbacks.
Agree wholeheartedly.
So, maybe one day we'll come back to that. But so Paul wasn't self-centered. He wasn't at all. But he'd leave a school because he had to. And he would go on to the next one, and then we'd leave, and then he'd go on to the next one, and then we'd leave. And by the time he was finished third grade, he'd been in 4 schools.
Will you speak to
Sure.
why he was changing schools so often?
Sure. When he was in his first 3 years of school, he went to the school where I worked. And it's an independent school for, average to above average kids. It has some learning specialists who did work with him, but he was not going to be successful there. By and large, the curriculum was pretty fast-paced and intellectually inclined. And so, but he was there for a 3-year-old program, a 4-year-old program, and kindergarten. And they were reluctant to take him into first grade, but he was an early reader. He learned to read in kindergarten. And so that was a strength, and they couldn't really figure him out. And one teacher who I still have a good relationship with, and who I just respect immensely in terms of her ability to assess children, she said, when he's paying attention, his ability to absorb new material is startling. But those moments are so unpredictable and few and far between that he's well behind his peers. So he was behind in every way that you assessed his skills. And so that school in his first grade year, and I won't get into the real hardships of his first grade year because we went on medication trials and he ended up not even being able to go to school. But I knew in the spring of his first grade year that he couldn't return to that school. So we went to the neighborhood public school where they had learning specialists, or the whole department, the whole county worth of learning specialists. And I thought that's good because these are people who've devoted their career to working with people who have disabilities. And that's what they want to do. They're not stuck with the child with disabilities. That's what they do. And so they were good to him. And he went into the regular second grade classroom and he qualified for something like 15 hours a week of a learning specialist. Well, the learning specialist loved him. The homeroom teacher loved him. The principal loved him. County psychologist who tested him a few times loved him. But they all said at the end of the year, we're not serving him well. We're not getting through to him. And so we think he deserves something more. So he left there after second grade. And then the county, it's probably like this nationwide. And this also was then, so I'm not familiar with every state and every era. But when he was getting 15 hours a week, that was a particular level of special education. It was level 2. If you're level 5, which was more services were required, then you couldn't be educated in any school in our county. But what the county would do is help you find an appropriate private school, and they would pay for it. And it had to be approved by the Maryland State Department of Education. So there are such schools that just are under their own auspices, but they conform to the standards. And so we together looked, and we didn't come up with anything. And so there was a new school that wasn't approved. And so we went there, really didn't have any choice. We went there. So that was going into third grade. And so that was his 1, 2, 3, that was his 4th school. And then he was there for a few years. And that was a school with a very low student teacher ratio, maybe 5, 6 kids in a class, mostly reading problems. And Paul's problem wasn't reading, but nevertheless, a low student teacher ratio, people who were learning specialists. And I never knew why they didn't invite him back. But when he was going into the 6th grade, they told me late in the year that he couldn't come back. And so that threw me for a loop because it was late in the year. I'm
sorry.
Well, we didn't find a school for the following year, so I had to homeschool him when I had the job that I had. So that entailed hiring people and putting together a program. Actually turned out to be a good year, but it was a hardship.
No kidding.
I went in through the summers not knowing where my child was going to school in the fall. And the first day of school would come fast. And it breaks your heart. All the other children just take for granted that you get that new lunchbox and you wait outside for the bus and you just get on it and you go. And I thought, we're not. So, but he took it all in stride until maybe, I think he finally put it together when he was about 7th grade, that every time he left a school, the other children stayed. But he didn't say it. You could just see him starting to doubt himself. But he had a really good year that year that he was homeschooled. And the teachers who worked with him one-on-one taught him a lot. And his intellectual curiosity and his interest in history and art and music. And he learned his multiplication tables. I never did. But, it was a good year and they loved him. But at the same time, he's going into adolescence. And I'm thinking peers are important.
Yeah.
So, it was never perfect. And then it wasn't long after that he was hospitalized. So
I already have a trillion things that I'd love to unpack, and I'll try to do it gracefully. You mentioned, I think it was his first grade teacher, mentioned that when he's aware and attentive, like it's incredible how much he can absorb. But those moments are far and few between, and it's very unpredictable when those moments are going to happen. And my take, you wrote that in the book too, and my take on that then and now was, as a person who hears that a lot from people, is that there shouldn't be any reason why that's unpredictable. Like maybe I'll accept it's unpredictable with the subsequent, let's figure out why he's attentive sometimes and not attentive other times. And that's something that I say as a professional I'm very, very passionate about the work I do, and I center every talk around the child. Usually the child's not there in these conversations. They are if we can help it, but when they're not, I think about, if I were this child, would I want people talking about me behind my back this way? Would I be really, am I being granted my best work here? And that's my focus. And it's very difficult for me, someone who is embedded in the system, who is asked to help, to do, because people think I'm a pain in the ass. So if it's in the school system, it's like I have to choose my battles. And
Sure.
if I'm outside of the school system as a consultant, we have these, you're in the education system, so you're familiar. We have these meetings that are like roundtable meetings with all of the wraparound services someone gets. And if someone says, well, our family did hire a counselor and consultant, and his name's Zach Rhodes, it's like people are like, oh, Jesus Christ, oh, great. And so it's very hard. I don't like that. I'm actually very averse to confrontation. I'm actually a very agreeable person in some sense. All of that to say, I can imagine that it was difficult for you to make heads or tails of that comment, or to even know to reflect on that, or what to do about that, or how to bring it up. But I'm wondering how someone like you thought about that statement then, and if you have a different take on it now.
The way I interpreted it then, and I don't think I've really changed, I haven't thought about it, is that what she meant by that is that some children, you can always get to them just after lunch. It was that food that gave them that lift, and then, okay, so teach him math after lunch, because that's his hardest subject. So that's when we could get him. So I think she meant not only were those moments when he was tuned in, few and far between, but there was no rhyme or reason as to when they came in. Was it once a week? Was it, there wasn't a pattern. And so as she would try to figure out, how do you work in the best way to meet this child's needs?
Yeah.
That's what she meant. And so that sentence probably didn't portray that very well, but I worked with her. That was still in the school where I worked. And so she was just so much on his she still feels bad that she couldn't serve him. She's a very sweet person and very talented. So that's what she meant by that. But I certainly had experiences with people over the years who would say, well, he just doesn't pay attention. And, he doesn't seem interested in what the class is doing. And that was upsetting to me, because I thought, he comes with a file that's about this thick, and obviously you haven't read through it, because it was easy to jump to the conclusion, again, this is our nemesis, that the child is blowing you off, that he doesn't care what you're doing, he's not interested in anything, he didn't hear you. So that was hard. And along the same lines, what was also hard for me is every time I took him to a birthday party, or he wanted to take a karate class, I had to decide, how much do I pull the adult who's in charge aside and tell them without boring them or turning their attention from what they've otherwise planned to do to pay attention to me. But then if I just dropped him off and didn't say, he has some differences and here's how you might notice them, I didn't know how to juggle that. So I'm just adding that in because it's not really an answer to your question, but
no, you did. I think that was a thorough answer. And you got what my second order ask kind of was too there.
Absolutely. And you know what? I can identify with what you said about them saying, oh, couldn't you have gotten somebody
Yeah.
this so seriously?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. Because I usually don't let something like that go. Like if there's something spectacular that someone can do, but only sometimes, that I can't refocus on anything. I have to think, what is left untapped here? There's something remarkable this person has to offer, and that we probably have to offer them that we need to figure out.
Well, there should be more people who have that as their goal, and I do think teachers get burned out, and
Sure. Yeah.
and certainly what I found in working with the special education people, we had these IEP meetings or ARD meetings, that's what they call them. We had them a few times a year, and it would be the parent and not the child, but if there was an outside psychologist or psychiatrist, and then a school system person, and then a couple county people who, speech therapists, occupational therapists, a lot of people around the table. And that always impressed me, because the resources that they're putting in to this one child and the amount of paperwork, of course, the paperwork was also dizzying. And I think in some ways it sort of contributed to glossing over what it is you might have questioned because of the sheer mass of it. They just sort of had you with the volume of paperwork, but nevertheless, you're signing and signing and signing things. So I look back on that and think maybe I didn't always question enough, but still, you could just tell around that table, they were much happier when the parent went along.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too, that they had a lot of experience with parents who didn't go along when they didn't need to push back. Because by golly, I'm fighting for my child and you're not paying attention to me, and I know what he needs. And so often the teacher's right.
I bet you've dealt with that.
Oh, yes, I have. And there is beauty in getting older. There is real beauty in getting older if you're lucky enough to get there. And that is, my peers used to be the parents that I was talking to. But as you get to be older than they are, you can just tell them like it is. It is, and part of it's just having done it over and over too, but just telling them, look, you're not doing the right thing by this child. A divorce. You're using the child as a pawn.
Yeah.
It is so perfectly clear that you are not. You're fighting each other, but you're putting the child in the middle and you're using the child. This is not in the child's best interest. You really should stop and think about it. Whereas when these people were my peers, I was more reticent to say that, even as I began to see it. But, I told this one mother, so focused on their own child, I said, look, the fact that you think the sun rises and sets in your child is a gift to that child. Everybody deserves parents who think that the sun rises and sets in them, but you don't want anybody else to think it because that would be bad for them.
Yeah.
When they go to school, they have to be respected. They have to be cared for, but they're a member of a group. And that's the important thing. So they are not the be all and end all, the brightest kid that ever came down the pike, the cutest, the best, the most deserving. If he wants this flag, then he gets this flag. No, he doesn't. If he wants to drink first, he gets in line first. No, he doesn't. So it's great that you have that. So if you tell them that way, in a way that allows them to, worship at the altar of the child, then let the other people off the hook, because that's not healthy. That's how we grow and develop. And they're equally important. But you can't expect those people to mirror you. And believe me, that'll screw your child up more than you even realize. You're not thinking. And so, when you're confident, they listen.
And there is some beauty and also some wisdom packed into every parent. And maybe I'm just not experienced enough yet, but every parent that I've had with an attitude that doesn't quite jive with reality or like really what's in the kid's best interest, there is some real passion there that just like I was saying about Paul, like I feel like that needs to be tapped into. Maybe it's misplaced or something like that. And it sounds like you're skilled at weaving through that.
But you know what? Life teaches you lessons and that's so obvious, because when my sister, who was a tutor for children with learning differences, told me when he was probably 4 or 5 that he had learning disabilities. And I said, he does not. And she said, no, it's kind of classic. He really does. I said, he does not. He's just behind the curve developmentally. And the only reason I repeat that is that I was in denial. But what I came to realize over time is denial's a rite of passage. You can't just go from here to there. So I wasn't impatient with the parent who was initially in denial. You just hope to get them over the hump. And I told parents too, you didn't order this child from a catalog. You know, you couldn't just check the boxes of what you wanted. And you got what you got. And your job is to do the best darn job you can, given what you got. It's not to change what you got. That shouldn't be your focus. You have to do that's your job. And that might be counter to what your instincts are, because this child's different than you.
I hate that term. I hate the term denial, even if it's true that that's what you were doing. But it's just a bugaboo of mine. But do you think that baked in there, maybe I'm giving you like too much leeway or something, but do you think that baked into the idea that no, he's not, he doesn't have developmental challenges or whatever it was you're denying, was sort of the sentiment that maybe you didn't know how to speak, like, I don't want him to think of himself as disabled, rather than,
oh, I didn't want
no, he doesn't need extra help, or, you know what I mean? There's that, like, denial would be like, no, don't give him any extra help, he's fine. And like a proper sentiment might be like, maybe he will need extra help, but I don't want him to use that as a crutch or something like that, or think of himself as disadvantaged.
I just think I didn't like the label, maybe. I don't know. It was a long time ago. But, you know, my father was a professor, and my siblings and I were good students, because that was just so dyed in the wool. I rebelled in some ways, but I didn't skip school. I sat in the front row, you know, the teachers liked me. I made eye contact. School was important. We were going to college after high school, just like you go to high school after middle school. There was just no question about it. So school was always important, of high importance. You know, my father would have rather caught us, you know, having some whiskey in the 10th grade than skipping a class. It was just like, you go to school, that's your job. And he never really did catch me with whiskey, but he was strict about school and otherwise pretty relaxed. So I don't know, maybe it was connected to that. It was like, that's not us. I don't know. I don't think it was that I wanted him to be somebody that he wasn't. I just didn't buy it. I just simply didn't buy it. I thought she was wrong. So I don't think you can always see your child as clearly as you could somebody else's child. You love them so much. I don't know. And maybe part of it is that it is an extension of you. And that's something you do get over. And there's stages when you think you want the opposite of that. Have nothing to do.
Right. This wasn't me. Yeah.
This one got mixed up.
I think I told you I have a 2-year-old daughter. And so in some ways I'm taking notes, like I'm learning through osmosis right now. But I didn't mean to digress too much from our story. Where we left off before I pulled us back was Paul was in 7th grade, and I think that was either the year of or the year after you had to homeschool him. And so if I could reset the table here, so you were working when the year that you had to do homeschool, you were working, and so you had to hire out help. And
well,
so
the county offered me 6 hours a week of what they called home and hospital teaching.
Yeah.
And I did have to laugh to myself when they said that. I thought, 6, huh?
So you could do 1 hour a day and then plus a lunch break. Yeah.
That's not gonna work. So I was lucky. By the end of October, I had a schedule, and it was good. And I was very lucky.
What was the home? It was just you raising Paul and your daughter.
Yeah. At that time, and so I had an art teacher who had been at the school where I worked for 30 years or so, and she had just dropped back to half-time. And she was an art teacher, but she was just brilliantly creative and very dedicated to kids, and had like 8 kids of her own. And so I said, would you consider doing this a few hours a day? And she thought it over, because she took it very seriously, but she did, and they loved each other. Paul started calling himself Paul Nyland, because her last name was Nyland. He wanted to be in her family. She'd take him out to dinner and things. So, and then I came across another woman who was a tutor of kids with learning disabilities, and she was really, really good at it. And then the county person. And so I tied it all together, and he had wonderful experiences, and he learned a lot. And his interest, as I said, in the world soared. And that was the case for the beginning of his 8th grade year too. And it was the summer between, no, it was 6th and 7th, but it was the summer between, after his first year of homeschooling, that summer I had applied, well, not that summer, before the summer, I had applied to a school that I thought would be perfect for him. And I thought he was old enough to make the commute. It was in Washington. And that's about an hour from here. And so I loved that school so much. I wanted to put the decal on my car before I even sent in the application, much less had him accepted. I loved it. When I fall hard. Everything I saw there just spoke to me. And I don't say that easily with regard to what I see in a classroom. And so it was so clear that these teachers were so committed to letting these kids be individuals, but still they were serious about intellectual development and ideas, but it was intertwined with the arts. And there, as I put it, they were much more interested in drawing out who they were than keeping them in line. And they did a masterful job of that balance. And so I wanted it so badly I could taste it. And so he was going into a medication change, and I knew it was a good idea because we had been on that medication and then gone off, and it wasn't as good. And we figured out, but he was invited for the summer program to this school that I was in love with. And I knew darn well they invited him for that 6-week program to determine whether they were going to take him in the fall.
Yeah.
And like I said, I wanted it more than I wanted anything. And so the psychiatrist and I agree on the plan for getting back on the medication that served him well. But
what was he taking medication for at that point?
Well, it had started out as attentional problems, and it still was for attentional problems actually, but because he wasn't well served by stimulants, he had gone into tricyclic medication.
Yeah, right.
And so there was a combination of a couple of them that served him pretty well. The one that served him the best, they took away from us because some child somewhere died. I thought it was worth the risk myself, but they didn't agree. So my hands were tied. But we had a satisfactory regime. We had tampered with it the year he was homeschooled. It was clearly not as good. So I was very eager to get it back in place before the summer program started. And if I got the blood work done every Friday and then called with the results, we would start the next dose 3 days later, and I had it all mapped out. And he would be on the other side of this change before the summer program started. And the changes were always really hard. He was really difficult. I felt sorry for him and angry with him at the same time. It just took all the patience in the world. He'd throw himself in a mud puddle. I mean, he didn't know how to behave at all. And so it was very hard to manage him. And that psychiatrist didn't return my calls, and I couldn't increase the dose because he had the medication. And I was beside myself. I was crying and leaving him messages, and I felt that. So the summer program starts, and we're halfway through the medication change. By the time we got to this 5th week of a 6-week program, the medication change was complete. And sure enough, that last week, he was his best, but it wasn't long enough. It wasn't long enough. So we didn't get in to that school. So I just said, Uncle, there isn't anything I can do. I put him in a school that, basically at the time, there were 2 kinds of special ed schools that fell into this level 5 category that the county would help you with. And one attracted students who were multiply handicapped, head injuries. They were physically handicapped. Maybe some of them had Down syndrome. There was just a whole array. It was more or less a catch-all, but kids who definitely weren't in an academic track, but they were still learning things and socializing. And then there was the track of kids that were, for the most part, bright. For the older ones, they said college bound, but learned differently. So the program had to be tailored accordingly. Paul fell in neither category neatly. So
Yeah.
I, of course, wanted him in the school that had the intellectual challenge because I knew he was hungry for it. But I gave up. And so I put him in a school where that wasn't the case. And he did have a class in English and a class in math, but otherwise he was doing landscaping and things like that, manual kinds of things. And he didn't like it. And I wanted him to love it because I was so burned out at that point after all the disappointments and the setbacks and the wanting what I couldn't have. And I said, Paul, there's life after school. We got a guitar teacher, you know, we read books, we did things on weekends. They're nice people there. So I never fueled his being disgruntled with it. But by the time he hit 10th grade, he was getting depressed, worrisome, depressed. And I knew that I had taken my foot off the gas. And so I applied to one of the schools that was more intellectually inclined. Not the one I really loved because I didn't want to subject us to that again. But I was happy and he got in. And he started in September and he did pretty well. But he had a breakdown of sorts in December of that year and was hospitalized. And so he never went back to that school. He ended up making the honor roll for that first semester. And I was really proud of him for that because not that I care about the honor roll, but he was taking oceanography and algebra and European history when he'd had, you know, like auto mechanics. And so he didn't have the preparation. Plus he's got all these learning challenges anyway. And he knocked himself out. He knocked himself out. And at the time too, I thought he put so much pressure on himself to do well because it was his proving ground that he just crumbled. But looking back, I know that there was more to it than that. So he was hospitalized and that was a nightmare.
What exactly was he hospitalized for, if you don't mind?
Well, one night he said to me, we were doing algebra and his sister helped him. She was home from college and then she went out and he and I were talking and he wasn't in a particularly bad mood. He was somber, I guess I'd say. And he'd gotten through the algebra and he just looked at me and he said, I don't care if I live or die. And I didn't really believe him, but my optimism can sometimes be a detriment. And also I'd had a psychologist who had tested him the summer before, and she said she was worried about his hidden depression. She said he's not sharing the level of his feelings.
Yeah.
So because of her testing and that I respected her, and he said that to me, I knew I had to call her, and I called her and she said, take him to the nearest hospital and take him now. She talked to him as well as to me, and I did. And they released him to my care that night, only if I would assure his admittance to a psychiatric hospital the next day. And so that's how that happened. So it was a whirlwind. We were doing algebra 1 hour, and the next hour he's being taken to a hospital in a different state. And I really didn't see it coming. So all of a sudden it wasn't just learning issues. There was mental illness. And, you know, I read now and I look back and I think, and I'll never really know, but it's just like there are some people that believe that bad experiences lead to addiction. And I'm not going to say that's always the case, but nor is it never the case. But I think sometimes bad experiences can lead to a mental break too. And I think it was, that boy put up with so much. So and they misdiagnosed him. They said he was schizophrenic, and then they said it was schizoaffective disorder, and they weren't nice to me. It was truly like a nightmare.
What was going on? What was he trying to say that he couldn't say at that point? Paul. Well, I mean, he said he didn't care if he lived or died, and you know, I guess I'm trying to put myself in your experience, and I'm thinking, there's only so much bandwidth, and it sounds like you've already exceeded it, and now you have to deal with this. And so there are different schools that you're trying to place him in that are actually that will acquiesce to his needs, wants, desires, ability to learn, and move him forward. And so you're trying all of these things. There are other systems like the medical system, the psychiatrists who just do straight up won't answer your calls that you have to deal with. And then now it seems like, all right, he's thriving in this space and making honor roll, but and he's saying, I don't care if I live or die, misdiagnosed. And I guess now I'm thinking, all right, I don't even know what you must be going through, how you're parsing all of this or making any sense of it. And I'm also wondering, is there something below the surface? I mean, I think you kind of said it. Is there something below the surface at this juncture that Paul is trying to get out, trying to explain to someone that he can't?
I think it was all of the above. I think that everything wasn't going swimmingly. He was happy with the school placement and he was taking it seriously. So those are good signs as far as a parent is concerned. But the summer before he started that school, I had a pretty good psychiatrist after leaving the one that didn't call me back. And I really bonded with her, and she was a gift to us. But then she moved to another state, and it was a big setback for me. And so I ended up staying in the same office because I had ruled out everybody in this little town. And I stayed in the same office and didn't like at all the woman that we inherited. She wasn't unkind. She was just so disinterested. That's the best word I can pin on her. She was disinterested. She didn't even really sit up completely straight in the chair, much less lean forward and show any signs of eagerness to engage with us. She was just kind of there.
Yeah.
And because I didn't like her and I didn't know where else to turn, I encountered a psychologist in the same office who I liked a lot, and started seeing both of them so that I could have the medication management from the psychiatrist, but connect with the psychologist. And it's the psychologist who had tested him and told me she was worried about him. So my antenna was up in that way. And she said, he is harboring a tremendous amount of feelings about himself and about, he's distrustful of the world. He looks at other people suspiciously. All of this information that I didn't have. And in some ways, it made some sense because of what he'd been through. Ego insult after ego insult, school after school, setback after setback, frustration with being trapped inside of himself as he was, with not being able to share his thoughts as readily or his, his visual perception. So I could understand that it was hard to be him. And so I wanted him to get the right kind of attention. And I certainly didn't want to deny that he might need something more than I had anticipated. So, and I go into most things pretty trusting. I don't know why. But when I first figured out that the doctor there who was in charge was arrogant, I still didn't pin incompetent on him. And I hoped for the latter. You can be arrogant to me, but if you're calling the shots and you're making good decisions, then I just have to turn the other cheek with that. There's no, we're not here for me. He had no bedside manner whatsoever, and he was rude. But then I came to find out that the diagnosis was wrong, the medication was wrong, and it was all one of the very worst chapters of our years. It was awful. It was just awful. And Paul wasn't himself at all anymore. He did have some psychotic symptoms, and he started to slow down so much cognitively, and he started to gain weight. He gained weight so fast that when he left for the hospital in mid-December, his pant size was like 32. And when he came back, it was like 38. or that Christmas, he did come home for Christmas. He, you know, he wore flannel pajama pants the whole time, because I kept thinking this will go back. We'll get back to normal. He carried that weight for years. So then, on top of feeling badly about himself for all these other reasons, he was also, they did characterize him as obese. So that was yet another ego insult. So, and then when we finally got away from there, the county helped me find another school. He couldn't go back to the school that was academic. So we went to a school that was part of a well-regarded psychiatric hospital campus in Baltimore. And the school was a separate facility, but it was on that campus. And the psychiatrist that we were assigned was wonderful. And he said, I'm afraid he either had a nervous breakdown, he said, to put it in lay people's terms, and he was overwhelmed and just couldn't cope and completely had a break and fell apart, or there's a degenerative brain disease. And he said, and I do see some signs that suggest some kind of dementia, and I'm worried about that. So you need to get a certain kind of test before I can do a thing with medication. And that made sense to me. So we picked out the doctor that I took Paul to get the test. And that doctor was also highly regarded, Johns Hopkins Hospital. And that doctor shook his finger in my face. I'll never forget it. And he didn't, the report takes a couple of weeks, but this was before Paul and I left. He called me into his office. So Paul didn't hear it. He shook his finger at me. He said, if you or I were on the medications that this child is on, we wouldn't be functioning any better than he is. He said, they've taken his life away and there's no excuse for it. He was furious. And I was relieved that he wasn't mad at me. He was just mad. He said, I don't care what the blood tests say. 2,000 milligrams of Depakote is too much. He was on 2,000 milligrams of one thing, 1,000 of another, and 600 of another. So when I went back and told the psychiatrist in the school, who was also going to get the report from the doctor, you know, that it was medication toxicity. That's how they labeled it. I was so relieved, and he explained to me that it would be more than a year to get him off. So I was still relieved. So I said, okay, yeah, we can do that. So it was a long haul, and then he did start to gradually come back.
So it was only after he weaned off of meds that he became more himself.
I remember telling his sister, who was in college, I said, you won't believe how much better he is. He's almost himself again.
What were the changes?
He started to laugh and to play his guitar and to go on the computer and things that he used to like to do. When he was in that cognitive slowing, he'd just stand in the middle of a room. And I would try to engage him in things that I thought would interest him, and he would think it was a good idea, and then he just couldn't carry it off. So and then he'd cry pretty readily. It was just so sad. I took him out to lunch one day, and he went into the men's room, and he didn't come out, and he didn't come out. And that was pretty typical. And finally I went in, and he was just standing in there. I had to zip his pants and walk him out, you know. So it was sad. It was sad. And all the while he's writing. He's writing on pieces of notebook paper and throwing these things away. Some of them he kept, but he didn't keep them like they were treasures. He would just had a spiral notebook, and some pages he tore out, some he didn't. So
I had a sense when you were in the book that he wrote because not for the product necessarily, it was for the process, the catharsis.
Yeah, I think it was his way of expressing what was on his mind, why he was inclined toward poetry instead of like a diary kind of thing. He did some, what he called journal. When I got his laptop after he died, he had one file called blog and one file called it was on blog and journal. And so there were poems and then journaling kinds of things in both files, but that's the two files he had. So, but most of it was poetry, but he would sometimes and when he'd go into a facility, you know, he'd write down a lot of things that he was thinking about. And his handwriting was always just atrocious. He had very little control over the pencil. So the laptop was a gift.
Yeah.
So after he died, I'm skipping way ahead, but I got that laptop, and it was just a couple days after he died that I looked in there, and he gave me his password to everything. He was so much of an open book in so many ways.
Open to a fault almost.
Oh yes. He'd kill me for telling you this, but he came home one night. He was probably 20. He said, I had sex last night. I just saw it. People don't tell their mothers. I told his sister. She goes, oh God.
What was the age difference? What was the age difference between Paula and his sister?
3 years.
Your daughter. 3 years.
3
And
years.
she was younger.
No, she's older.
Okay, sorry.
She's older.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's older. So I used to say if I'd had him first, I wouldn't have had her.
Yeah, I understand.
That was a joke. But so anyway, I forget where I was. I'm like Paul.
We were at he was open to a fault.
Yeah. So he had given me. I knew his Facebook password, his email password, his laptop password. But I opened it up and it said, ask for face recognition. And I thought, that's going to be a little tricky.
Yeah.
Real tricky.
How do you pull this off? Yeah.
Yeah. Since he's in a box in the dining room,
Yeah.
I don't think I'm going to pull this off. So I disabled the face recognition, and my hands were shaking and typing in the password. And then I see all these poems, and some of them I did recognize because he would email me sometimes 2 or 3 at a time. And I can remember him saying one time, I'd love to share these with you. And so to my knowledge, he didn't share them with, very broadly anyway. But so I recognized completely a few of them. And then there were plenty that I didn't. And, I was so grief stricken, and just reading what he wrote was so moving to me. And you can imagine, it would be for anybody in that circumstance. But all I could think is, no one who knew him would believe that he wrote these words because he was so reticent. And so my first thought was, I'm going to publish them. And that's, one thing led to another. But
his poems are weaved in the book.
Yeah.
They're so gorgeous. Do you think I'm similarly, I have things that I write down on. I leave a trail of things I write down behind me, and I think probably some of my best work ever in different respects is something I'll never publish. Do you think there was something to that? There's something so special, I guess, about there was something that he wrote for himself and maybe for you that he wasn't really. He's humble. He wasn't trying to get notoriety for it. It wasn't trying to be, mind blowing or something like that. But if people could only have seen it, their minds would have been blown.
I know. And I think in some ways he had, and he probably didn't allow himself to go there very often, but he had a fantasy of being recognized.
Yeah.
And I would at first want to say discovered, and I don't think it was that far along, but just some recognition, because he didn't get much recognition. And because in his poems, a few times he said something about his self-worth was being wasted, and once he said, and my dreams, books written by me, and and then something else. And so I think he knew he had a gift. But Keely and I, his sister, we still can't figure it out because we're just surprised at his vocabulary. He didn't really have what you think of as an education. He was, from school to school, and then his health diagnosis compromised his one shot at an academic program. And he would use words. I'm looking him up and thinking, did he use this correctly? And then his themes of angst, and not that just teenage angst, like you're mad at everything. The things he said about the government and you know, the big brother kinds of things, I thought, you know, he had a real point. He was one of the people who was oppressed. And he
Yeah.
wrote about that oppression.
Yeah.
And so I didn't blame him or see him as an out of control, just angry, blaming everybody else. It was just a fact. And he had a sensitivity to people who were oppressed. And so he expressed that too. So, and I didn't put all of his poems in the book, you know, and I just had to decide where they fit. And I don't know how good of a job I did with that, but I couldn't, when I first thought about publishing just the poems, I thought, okay, so you're his mother and you think they're really good.
I was gonna see if you ever had that thought. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I sure did.
Of course, his mom thinks it's great. Yeah.
Sure. And I also thought he was really good looking and, you know, really kind hearted.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just tell you all this. But he, I thought it's that discrepancy between what he would have to say and what his thoughts were that I found so incredible. And I was both proud and wondrous about that combination and how he tolerated it as well as he did, and how much relief that gave him or didn't give him. And, you know, he'd write in hindsight too. I mean, he'd write something about reflecting back on the hospital. And he'd write it maybe when he was 23, and this had happened when he was 17. So he was so astute in a lot. So it wasn't just that it was flowery poetry. It usually had a message. Some of it was tongue in cheek. You know, he did have a sense of humor. And so
it sounds like for a person who was thought to have never been paying attention, he was hyper attentive to things that were
he
that he could
you
explain
asked
beautifully.
early on where he would go.
Yeah.
Well, for the first time ever, I'm thinking some classroom somewhere with a professor. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. And you know, people with ADD, and I know this from firsthand experience, you can miss a lot of what's being said if you're watching a movie, or you'll read a book and you get 3 pages through and you think, I didn't absorb any of that, I've got to double back. But also when you have a task, you can't get off of it. So you do go from losing the thread to a over focus, or that's not really fair, but a hyper focus.
Yeah.
I guess. And so he definitely had that. You know, the fact that he could play the guitar when his hand shook. And a friend he made late in life who I never met, but I've had several phone conversations with now. He lives in LA, and he just reached out to me after Paul's death and very kindly did so and told me things, you know, his impressions of Paul. He said, I could never understand why Paul got down on himself. And I thought, oh my goodness, you just don't know, you know, what Paul's life entailed, because Paul met him when he was 28 or 29. Yeah. And Paul was trying to pretend like he was just a regular guy. He didn't divulge what he'd been through.
Right. So, and that from that person's perspective, he was somebody who had talents and who was
pro-social. And the thing that stuck out, he said, he's an amazing writer. I said, I know, he really is good at that. He said, and he's an amazing guitar player. And I thought, he is. He said, so that's why I couldn't understand why he gets so down on himself. He said, and he's so musical. Yeah. He said, he got me interested in bands that I now will, you know, make a whole trip out of going to see. I think it was Fish. Yeah, he said, I was never a Fish fan until Paul got me into it. He said,
wholesome Vermont band, by the way.
Oh, okay. Well, Paul always told me, you might remember this from the book. He told me that people in Vermont are nicer than they are in Maryland.
Yeah, probably. I think that's probably true. But hey, sometimes in a passive aggressive way, so you got to be careful.
But I always thought with Paul, it was always, okay, so it means it's geography that gave you bad experiences. But, you know, if none of this would have happened if you don't.
Right. I'd like to talk about, I mean, you talked about him being over medicated, and that was imposed on him. Can we talk about him self-medicating and drug use and
Yeah.
that's eventually what led to a fatality?
And that didn't start until he was in his early 20s, because he lost a year of high school and he was already old for his grade. So he was 20 by the time he got out of high school. And it was within that next year that the first thing I saw was beer bottles under our back deck.
Yeah.
And I'd see like 6 or so. And so I'd throw them away, not sure who would come around. And then a couple of days later, there'd be just as many. Or so I asked him about it, and he was very defensive about it. He said, well, I am 21 and I didn't take the beer from you. I bought it myself. And I said, so is it the mature thing to do to stash the bottles under a deck? I do remember saying that to him, but I talked to him because I said, it worries me with regard to your driving, and it worries me with regard to the medication that you take. And it also worries me why you're doing it. But he didn't go there with me. He would just kind of put up with me like I guess any kid would with their parent. And then he turned to drugs, and I don't know exactly when or who introduced it, because I didn't know it was happening until we hit a crisis. And when he was impossible to deal with. He was so agitated and so angry and would just blow up. And I made him sleep on the front porch one night. I said, you can't come in the house because you're just too rude. And so I locked the door, turned off the lights, I went upstairs. I did give him a pillow and a blanket, but I just said, I can't put up with this. And it was later that same period of time, I was having my family over and some friends for 4th of July. And if somebody was coming over and I was going to do something that interested me, he'd be all the more needy. He would make sure he was distracting me. And because he was unhappy is how I viewed it. But I remember taking him out on our front porch and saying to him, I've had it. You can't stay here. And you choose now. The homeless shelter, we had one right around the corner. And I said, the homeless shelter or a psychiatric hospital. I will drive you. You choose. And he said, the hospital. So in 15 minutes, we were in the car. And the only psychiatric ward near us was about a 45-minute drive. And so we're on the highway, and he's telling me where to turn. He always had marvelous sense of direction. He'd see something once, and he could navigate.
And that's where I stopped relating to him.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, and I think it was that visual perception. But anyway, he all of a sudden his angst just evaporated, because there must have been relief in facing the fact. So we're sitting there with the intake nurse, and he says, I'm addicted to drugs. And I just thought, well, that's new information. I mean, I was shocked. I was really shocked. I wasn't angry. I was just shocked. And I couldn't imagine him in the world that I knew nothing about, the world, the underground world of drugs, with Paul, who would be the kid who'd go to the candy bar to get a candy bar, and I'd give him a $5 bill because that's all I'd had. And he'd come back with the candy bar and no change because he was an easy mark. And so I just couldn't imagine it. But he wound up going into treatment from there, and then to another, and then he relapsed and got kicked out, and then he was on the streets of Baltimore. And he changed from cocaine was his first drug, and then some years later it was heroin.
And it sounds like for whatever treatment was, it didn't exactly serve him well, evidently. If he was,
I don't think it did at all. Again, we met some nice individuals here.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
But I don't think it did at all. I think it served only to further heighten his feelings of low self-worth, because they had to redeem themselves. They had to apologize to all the people that they'd hurt. And when I look back on that, I just want to slam my hands on the desk and say, what about all the people that heard him? And I know that sounds like a maternal protective thing to say too, but it's just, no, this isn't going to help him. And he'd sit in a group where they were supposed to talk, and he didn't like doing that kind of thing. And that wasn't going to get him known to the people. So it wasn't a good system for him. And then if you stepped outside the lines, you were punished.
Yeah.
And so he relapsed and they kicked him out. And then he wound up incarcerated, and he was 8 years in Baltimore, 7 of which we didn't have any choice because he was under the auspices of, well, maybe it wasn't 7 altogether. Maybe it was 5, but it was a long haul that we were obligated to the legal system. So he did go to drug court. You want to know why he got in jail in the first place?
Yes, please.
I could tell that's what you were going to get. Because he had an addiction problem, and then he left the treatment, and then he said to me, I've got to get out of Baltimore, but I want to keep my job. And so we found him a room to rent in a place that was near his job so that he could walk to work. And he had more bad luck, but I can't go through all of it, or you and I'll be here until 2 a.m.
Yeah.
But he moved in with 2 people that I thought were a little older than he was, firefighter and a paramedic. And I thought, oh, this is good. They're community minded. They're squared away. This is what they do. You know, nice people. And he has his job, and he'd had it before he went into treatment. So, and they held it for him for a couple of years. And so this is going to be good. Well, one of the 2 people that I thought was so responsible was a cocaine addict. I don't like to use the word addict, but that's how he referred to himself. So that wasn't good, obviously, for Paul. And Paul would always do, and maybe this is true of everybody, but Paul didn't just like go downhill like this. Paul went on a downhill racer. He went from doing pretty well to, you know, just totally out of control, chaotic use in what seemed to me like a day. And when he fell into that, he stole from another roommate, unsuspecting. He stole $500. And so that they called the police, and the police came, and he was arrested, and he was incarcerated for that. And he did pay the money back, and he felt terrible about it, but he needed his drugs. So
yeah.
He felt terrible about that. But then when he got out, he was put on 2.5 years of probation, and he had to live in a treatment facility. And he made it for 2 years and 5 months. And he relapsed a month before his 2.5 year probation was up, and he went back to jail. And so he confessed to the program too about his relapse.
And what was the response?
They kicked him out of the program where he had done so well, and he had a job, and he felt pretty good about the job. And he was serious. He would be so serious about following all the rules and doing the right thing. And then he just, I don't know whether it was the influence of somebody else or just the way he was feeling about himself. I don't know. But he relapsed. And like I said, and that time too, he went down fast. It went from, I didn't know, to this is a disaster. So he was kicked out of the program. They did find a place for him to live, but he only was there for a few days before he broke a rule. It wasn't drug related. And so he went to jail. And then he was in the worst place in the world. It's the worst place in the world. It's called Central Booking, and it's in Baltimore City. It's in a horrible neighborhood, but that's beside the point. It's just a horrible place. And he was there for months while they kind of played with him, I thought. they threatened him with the state penitentiary. Can you imagine?
No.
And then, so he'd have a hearing, and then he'd go back to jail, and he never understood what his fate was going to be. And I think now that they were just trying to scare him. But it was drug court. And then when he was finally, the state's attorney wanted him to go to prison. His public defender had mixed feelings about it. But I pulled a string because I was desperate I was scared to death that they were going to put him in the penitentiary. So I knew somebody who used to work in that system, and she knew somebody who knew the judge, and one thing led to another, and maybe that was an influence. So he got sent to another treatment program, even though that wasn't what was really being advocated for. So he was thankful, I was thankful, and he was doing everything right. But they created situations where he'd mess up and then they'd send him back to jail again. For example, he had to meet with his probation officer, then he had to go to a 12-step meeting, then he had to go to his psychologist, then he had to go to his house meeting. And he had to be, and it was all over Baltimore, but Paul knew Baltimore like nobody's business. He could get where he needed to go, whether he walked or used the bus, he knew that system. So that wasn't a problem. But the probation officer was 20 minutes late for their appointment. And she kept him for the full time, which meant he was 20 minutes late for the house meeting. So they put him back in jail.
Oh my gosh.
And I think that she did it on purpose. I think, and again, it wasn't until I was writing the book. It's amazing how when you pull things together, you realize them. I think that somewhere in that system, they knew that I had done something to give him a break, and they didn't like it.
Wow.
So I finally told his public defender, who I did like, I said, I don't know what it is, but somebody's gunning for him. He's not doing anything wrong. He keeps going back to jail. It's just awful. He's terrified. And that terrified state of his is going to do him in. And after that, it stopped. So, and then he was on another year's probation. And so he finally lived that down, and then he never had any more tangling with the law. And when he left there, it was probably 27, maybe 26, 27. And he lived to be 34. So I
always ask people, clients of mine who see me for addiction, to talk about addictive involvements or what addiction is from like a third party perspective. And I ask, why do people who are addicted, what kinds of consequences do they ensue? And then why do you think people who are addicted tolerate these consequences, so that they're removed from the question, and then maybe they can answer it and invoke themselves in the...
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
And so I'm thinking about Paul now, thinking about myself, thinking about people I've talked to. And I'm still remembering you saying, you're on the way to something. It's not like it's pleasant. It's probably pretty uncomfortable when you're driving him, when he was younger, to the hospital, because you said it's a homeless shelter or hospital. And even though those were the circumstances, he was navigating and sort of felt in his element there. And I'm relating to that. Not that I'm directionally challenged. Anyone who knows me knows that, but then I can find flow. But when I can find it as far and few between, drugs always gave me that sense, like I could escape. And there were things that I was seeking that drugs weren't perfect for, because they had the consequences, but they were a good proxy because they made me feel either nothing or well when I couldn't get the sort of source of satisfaction otherwise. So I would tolerate the negative effects. I would tolerate, like, I think I needed it. I'd clutch it. So like I might steal the $500 or something like that. And I would tolerate the just discomfort, the burning bridges, because I thought I need this thing. I'm wondering if you have a sense of why Paul tolerated destructive consequences.
I think it was because he had no skills. He was getting older. He had nothing he was really good at. He had little work experience, and what he had was really the bottom of the ladder, and he didn't see a way out. He didn't have confidence. had tried taking college classes when he was first out of high school, and that didn't work. And he saw all of his family, you know, being successful, and I think he was afraid of his future. So I think he'd get down on himself, and I can really understand that. I don't know how he was as resilient as he was in some ways. So he'd get down on himself, and then that temptation was there, and it's an escape, and it makes you feel good. And you know, one poem that hit me really hard, it's brief, and I put it in the book. It's called Hidden. And it makes me sad. Here's how it goes. She's the love of my life, my moral disgrace. When she travels my veins, I take on new traits. Unbound by glory or something catastrophic, she hides my skeletons in my bedroom's closet. And what made me so sad with that is that he called it his moral disgrace. So that was just yet one more thing that he felt bad about himself for.
Yeah.
So I think he was just, there were no answers. And you know, there always are answers. You think about the person who's on the bridge and, you know, I'm just in my last day that I can't take. There are answers. Come down and we'll work on the answers. And so I don't think Paul ever was suicidal. He said to me once, he said, do you think I'd ever kill myself? This was not when he was a teenager. I said, no. He said, why do you say that? And I thought for a minute. And I said, I guess I said that because I think you kind of like yourself. And he said, I do. So he had a lot of strengths, but I think that giving into those, to the drugs was an escape. And so, but he'd go a good long time, you know, when he came home, the year that he died, he came home in June. He hadn't been on drugs for a few months. And then it was all the way till the next February that he didn't, you know, he'd have a beer sometimes, you know, when the family would have dinner, and I never worried about that. He told me once, he said, I want to get some marijuana. And I said, I don't think that's a good idea. And he said, I do because it helps me. And I told him not to. I said, I don't care if it helps you or not, it's not legal and you shouldn't do it. And I look back on that now, I should have gotten it for him. You know, because I think that it probably does help some people who have his anxiety and his maybe tendency to turn toward a relief, a substance that gives you some relief. And that would be a far cry improvement over heroin that had fentanyl in it.
I'm curious to get your take on this, because I know that it's one of the final sections of your book. You talked about, you know, you sort of extrapolated from that point and said, you know, if I'd only really known, or if anyone had ever, if I'd ever been privy to the idea that there was not really good pure heroin out there, but there are replacement drugs that you can take that are pure and predictable. I'm curious to think, like, do you think, before we even get there, do you think the same could have been said for if you knew there was, let me back up, actually. I'm always having this dialectic in my own mind, and this is why I'm asking you. And it's rare that I get someone so lucid and in like a free-flowing conversation. But do you have the same mentality around all drugs insofar as they're pure, taken with the idea that they're life-enhancing, not destructive? Or do you think some drugs are better than other drugs, or more dangerous necessarily?
I don't know about better or worse, but I think they should all be legal. Because it's the prohibition of the drugs that's killing people. Yeah. It's not the drugs. And so I think they should be legal, and it would solve so many problems. I don't understand why we didn't learn with alcohol. I mean, that's just such a good test case.
Yeah. Why can't we generalize the principle?
You take it away, and it gives rise to crime.
Yeah. People
are using more dangerous substances. The people that used to like to just have a couple beers were all of a sudden drinking, God knows, moonshine. So the substances were not regulated. the crime was running rampant, and it was all just a colossally bad idea. So we self-corrected. We doubled back. And then we criminalize and then keep adding to our determination to criminalize drugs. And it's just, and we didn't do it for the reasons that we say that we did it. And so I don't know which drugs would be better than others. You know, I know that alcohol causes some people terrible problems, and it can be life-threatening, and it can ruin families, and people lose control. But it didn't work to take it away. So I don't see why that doesn't apply to other drugs as well. And so, you know, the fact that we can't even legalize marijuana, just, although we did make some progress yesterday, you know, baby steps, but it's crazy.
I'm smirking, I should tell you, because I don't remember who said it, but someone wrote, it was like on social media, it said, drugs are being legalized, marijuana, psilocybin drugs are being legalized across the country, and good thing, because I think I'm going to need some right now.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. I know. Where were they for the past 4 years?
Right, exactly.
But, you know, people are going to use what people are going to use, and people are always going to use substances to alter their mindset, to relax, to escape, whatever your incentive is. And chaotic use can become problematic, but you don't take all of the substances away from all of the people. You know, overeating can become problematic. We don't take things away. And when you look at medical conditions like diabetes or lung cancer, that's often brought on by people's bad habits. Mm-hmm. But we coach them, we try to help them, but we never dismiss them from treatment because they're falling into those bad habits. So I think that what we've done with drugs, and we're singular as a country in how much we've cracked down on it. We have the largest prison population in the world without a close second. We have the highest overdose deaths in the world without a close second. And the cartels are making money hand over fist. I don't really get it, because it's just common sense. It's just plain old common sense. This is a colossal failure. And it's done nothing. And we're incarcerating, the dealers, they're murderers. Mm. No, they're not. That's just somebody else's child who's supporting his own addiction. He doesn't know what's in those drugs. And that's a real crowd pleaser too, when you can put on the front page of the paper that, we got the guy, you know, who sold the drugs to the young man who died. Well, now, okay, he's put away. Do you ever see a reduction in the death toll because of those practices? Do you see less illicit drugs or dangerous drugs? No, but boy, people like it.
I'm impressed by you and people like you who you lost your son to a fatal drug overdose, and I can't say with any assurance that were I in your position that I wouldn't have gone ahead and cast blame on something that was low hanging. I don't know that I could be in your position and not just say, okay, the drugs are bad, or dealers need to go, or Purdue Pharma has to, we have to stand at the door with slingshots or something like that. What do you think it is about you, or how you're in touch with Paul's life, or your own life, or your own critical thinking, I guess, that
maybe that's part of it. But what I find with some parents who lost a child, and I've encountered more by being one, is that I find, and this isn't universal, but some of them will say that it was the pharmaceutical drug that started their addiction because, he had his wisdom teeth out and then he got the painkillers, and that's what happened. Because they're ashamed of the drug overdose and street drugs are a low life thing to do. So they kind of smoothed it over by saying it was prescription drugs. And I just think to myself, that's not what happened. It's so few people that happened with. I mean, prescription drugs hit the streets because we got 30 of them when we needed a half of one or two. And so they went to the streets. It wasn't the person who was prescribed the prescription drug that had never used street drugs before and took that prescription and then became addicted and died. That's like 1% of the death toll. But we are so damn determined, and we have been for years, to cut down on prescription drugs. And, you know, the hell with the pain sufferers and all those people. And, you know, it's all the doctors and the pharmacies now are like getting their hand into it. And do you take this massive system that you've created to control to monitor the prescription drug and compare it to the death toll? It hasn't made one bit of difference. And the studies that are coming out of Harvard or Boston, you know, Mass General, or you know, the Academy of Sciences and Engineering, they're all saying the same thing, that the prescription drugs have about a 1 to 3% impact on the death toll, and that what we need is treatment, the availability of a full array of treatment options and harm reduction. That's what we need. But no, they don't want to do that. They want to go after prescription drugs, and doctors and pharmacies are getting involved. And it's just, so I think that it's just common sense to not blame the dealer. I feel sorry for the dealer. You know, everybody's caught up in this, and I feel so sorry for vulnerable people, because if you think that Paul was maybe not as readily as you able to pull himself away from it because of something else that became more attractive as you mature, he didn't have that. But what about the person who's poverty stricken and who generations of his family's been poverty stricken? He sees no way out. I'd get high all the time too, if I could. So I don't blame the drug user. And I don't know that I mean, I can get plenty mad about our laws and our refusal to even adopt practices that other modern countries have adopted successfully. So I guess I do, you know, have some anger, but it's not directed toward the drug dealer.
So, you know, you won't get me to push back on any of the sensible things you just said. Could you talk about what happened near the end of Paul's life? I mean, you don't have to talk in any too big detail, but
he was doing pretty well. He'd gotten a job, and it had been a while since he'd worked. And he loved his job. He was a bicycle delivery driver for a sandwich shop in town. And he knows the town like the back of his hand. He loves his bike. That was his main mode of transportation. And so he was good at it because his sense of direction is good, happy. And he relapsed after about a year, the better part of a year. And he told me, and he said, "I'm scared, Mom. I'm really scared." He said, "I don't want to lose everything I've gained because of one relapse." He said, "That's crazy." And what he was meaning was the job, and he had an apartment. He had never had an apartment before. He had rented a room in a house or been in some recovery house or some situation like that, but he had an apartment. And I helped him. I mean, the shoestring on which we decorated this apartment, but still, we enjoyed doing it, and he loved it. So he said, "I can't lose everything." And so I said, "Well, what do you think you should do? You should call your psychiatrist." And he said, "Oh, he doesn't help me, Mom." And I said, "But he may not help you, but he's a conduit to somebody that could help you." "No, I'm not calling him." I said, "Call him, please call him." So he did. I handed him the phone. He left a message. But the next day, and that night, he said to me, he said, "I'm just going to go to bed and pray." And I thought to myself, me too. But we'd been through this before, so I was heartsick because he was doing so well. But I think he was one of those people that he had taken a step and that each step was going to get him more toward a better, a more even life. But maybe, who knows? So he said, I'm going to take myself to the emergency room here in Annapolis, because if you tell them you're suicidal, they'll take you. And so I didn't know that, but said, okay. So we took himself there. He called me from there. He said, they're moving me to another hospital, a treatment facility tomorrow. And so he was glad about that. And when he got there, he called me, but the social worker there called me. And I was really glad about that, because once Paul became an adult, nobody wanted to talk to me. They were ridiculous about not talking to me. He would talk to me. It was never like he said, don't let her in the room. So it wasn't him. They were just so rigid with their interpretation of the HIPAA laws.
Of course.
So, but she called me and she said, I want you to know this is a 2-week program only, and you can't stay longer than 2 weeks. So we have our eye on a facility in Maryland, on the Eastern Shore, that would be good for him. But there's a snafu with the insurance and I have to work on it. And it usually, I think he qualifies, but it usually takes a month and we can't go any longer than 2 weeks.
Right.
So I said, okay, thank you for telling me. And then you hang up and you come up with all these questions. Well, how much does it cost if the insurance doesn't come through? Is there anything I can do to hurry it along? All these things. Called her back the next day. She didn't call me back. Called her back. Paul called me every day and he said, I don't really understand it, but I'm really hoping they solve it. But a week into his 2 weeks there, he smoked a cigarette in the bathroom and they kicked him out. And so he came home. So the next step became moot. But when he came home, he said to me, I'm going to look on the bright side because I can do this and I won't lose my job. He said, I was really worried I'd lose my job. So I'm going to go back to my job. He said, and if we could get me Suboxone, I know I can handle this by myself. Because when he was in a treatment facility, maybe a year and a half before that in Florida, they had given him a little bit of Suboxone. He didn't leave with any. So I printed out a list of doctors that prescribed buprenorphine, and I started making phone calls, and I struck out. I hadn't given up. There was a list, and you know, I will say one person yelled at me, and I doubt it was the doctor. It was whoever answered the phone, but just really raised his voice and said, don't you realize you're prolonging the problem? That he could be on that for the rest of his life, and it's just another drug. And I don't know, I felt so intimidated. I don't know why I was, because I'm not by nature, but I guess you're overwhelmed when you're in that vulnerable position. So I had not given up, and he died that night or the next night. So he was not in a place where he wanted to be using drugs and people were saying to him, you need to go into treatment. He was saying, please world, help me with this. And he just struck out. And so that's what's just so hard to cope with, is that there was no place to go here. So he lies to the emergency room. Then he goes to the other place and they don't keep him and they won't call me back. Oh, and they dismiss him to the care of his psychiatrist, who wouldn't call us, Paul or me. And then I found out after Paul died, it was because Paul owed him a balance, $300. And the only reason he owed a balance is because he skipped an appointment. And I know darn well Paul would have been afraid to tell me. But if this doctor would have ever talked to me, Paul wouldn't have had a balance. I mean, I would have either made sure Paul went to his appointment or I would have paid the balance. Not to coddle him, but I wanted, that relationship was primary. He needed that relationship and he had lost it and I didn't know it.
Yeah.
And there was a pattern in his life too. Every time he'd lose his mental health provider, he'd go to self-medicating. And that's exactly what happened here. It was just after Christmas that he skipped the appointment. So he didn't go back in January. By February, he relapsed. And in March, he died. Well, no, April, beginning of April. So, and the same thing happened before he went to Florida. The insurance change lost him the place that he had, and he was looking for another place, and he self-medicated. And it was the same every time.
You just said something that stuck with me, that he struck out, and I keep thinking, like I feel like the world let him strike out and it didn't need to. I'm wondering how you have managed to stay so resilient despite that. And I'm saying resilient relative to people I've worked with who just adopted just a bitter, resentful, almost nihilistic attitude toward the world when things like this have happened. And I don't blame them.
I don't really blame them either, because everybody handles grief in a different way. And one thing is for sure, you can't shortchange it. You can't work around it.
Yeah.
It's a given. And, it is not easy. But I guess just without really even thinking about it, I channeled my grief into trying to minimize the other people falling into the same trap, because that's what he would want me to do. And the antidote to hard times, whether your hard times are living life on the streets as an addicted person, or being homeless, or whatever it is, losing somebody, is an interest in life or a purpose in life. That is you get outside of yourself. So when you're bitter and just shutting down the whole world, I think that's focusing much more on your loss. And by golly, you can't change where you are.
Yeah.
So all you can do is go forward. And another belief I have, and I don't mean to minimize the grief, because it's a sneaky emotion. You think you're on the better side of it, and smacks you in the back of the head and gets you good. I've never watched the election returns without him. He was highly interested in politics. So yesterday I was tearful a lot of the day. But what I was going to say is, we mourn the loss of people because life is precious and we value it. And he should have had his. That's why it's such a dreadful loss. We mourn that. But I still have that precious thing. So do I throw myself in the grave because I can't pull him back out? I can't.
Yeah.
So my life has to be, if it's so damn precious, then do something with it. And if it's not precious, then don't be all gloomy because he lost. What did he lose? You know what I'm saying? It's kind of a weird way to think about it. I lost my father when I was young. And so I know grief, and I've lost other people. Of course, you can't be my age and not, but I experienced it early on. And you just learn that you don't have any choice. And you got to, that person too would want you. I can hear Paul's voice. I've never had like a seance experience. I'm not really talking to him. I wish I were, but I can hear his voice. I can hear him now saying, "You go, Mom." He would want me if I can make a difference for one other person, then his experiences weren't for naught. And so I am impassioned about it, but I'm not, bitter. I'm disgusted with our government and our refusal to see what couldn't be any clearer. And the incentive behind it is all pretty insidious. But, it takes people like you and me and a whole lot of us to make a difference. We can't just sit back and complain about it either.
Yeah. I remember you said that the antidote to tragedy in life or hard times or loss is a purpose. I remember I started this podcast that we're on to bring it to a meta level because I was doing training for parents, and it was supposed to be about kids and development. And so like a handful of people maybe would listen to it. And I don't know what it was, maybe the algorithm or something like that. And all of a sudden I thought like 10 people would listen, and I got the 2,000 people listened to this podcast I did. And so I got serious about it. And then I started talking about my own experiences, talked about addiction, mental health, and life experience. And I remember one of the first things that came back to me before I'd written a book was I had a phrase that was something like, you're worth taking care of. And if you can't convince yourself you're worth taking care of for yourself, then at least you're worth taking care of for the people around you who you love, who you'd like to be able to take care of better, or something like that. And I remember thinking that's so like banal and silly, and getting responses back from that saying, "Oh, that really changed my life." And I realized at that point how extremely little it takes when your attitude and your mind and your heart are in the right place to change somebody's perspective or life for the better, to do something, and that's like heart-wrenching in a sense that people, on one hand, it's sad that people haven't taken the time to think about something that seems so simple, or at least haven't given themselves the opportunity to. And on the other hand, it's very empowering. And I think as I was reading your book, that's what I kept thinking, is that you're doing this thing for all the right reasons. You're doing something that's, I can imagine at least that you wrote the book and it was therapeutic for you to do it.
It
And
was.
you're reliving the quality moments of your life and Paul's life, and reifying him in a sense, like giving him a legacy. And then also, that you're extending this work in a way that people are going to absorb, and someone out there, I know that you already have had feedback, but people are going to find it helpful, find it like, oh, Paul felt this way, this is how I feel. Maybe I'm not insane. Like I
Yeah.
have felt by reading other people's work similar to yours. Or maybe it's a parent who says, this is how I felt raising my child. Maybe it could be okay, or maybe I wasn't crazy, or just knowing that someone else is out there who's experienced the same thing.
I
So
would like to think that some parents, well, the people that don't have firsthand experience with addiction, I'd like to think that their hearts are touched just by the realization that good people can go down a dark path that's not of their making. It's not a character flaw, it's a set of circumstances. I want that.
yeah.
But then people who do have somebody in their life and they've either shut them out or they're ashamed of them, one or the other, that maybe it frees them up to talk about it. Because if we talked about it more, first of all, we'd get more help.
Yeah.
And then we'd get more awareness. If my child had cancer, people would be signing up to make me dinners. But when your child is suffering with addiction, then people don't really know what to say. And I want to break down those barriers, because it's not a character flaw. I am certainly not ashamed of him. And you know what? I never was. I may have been too stoic in terms of sucking up a lot of the burdens myself, but I wasn't ashamed of him. In fact, I've always admired him. And so I just want other people too to be free to say they made a mistake. Our society right now, it doesn't just apply to this subject that I am impassioned about, but people who don't know anything about health insurance or whatever the topic is, just pass judgment because somebody told them, or like we said in the beginning, it's just the way it is. Everybody knows it. Take the time to dig a little deeper, make a thoughtful decision, find out the facts. It's a very rewarding thing to do. And you can have different philosophies, but base them on factual information. And I think what lends people, or gives you a tendency to do that, is people are very guarded when it comes to saying they made a mistake. And I can't tell you how many people have said to me, out of kindness, when I say I made mistakes, oh, no, you didn't. They want to protect me. Oh, no, you're good. I know I'm good. I never questioned that. I'm good. And I made mistakes. It isn't, they're not mutually exclusive. First of all, we all make mistakes.
Yeah.
And second of all, I think that dealing with that, recognizing that, putting that out there is a lot healthier than just pretending like it didn't happen. And it's more helpful to other people, because if people can be freed up, then you don't have to say it was her wisdom teeth. You don't have to contribute to the massive misunderstanding because of shame. It all works against moving us forward. Be open about it. So
there's something about the way that you wrote the book, that you were very open about things that you might call a mistake, that you might call mistakes now, and you were humble about it. And somehow it read in this way, and I don't know if you intended to do this or it's just sort of natural for you, but it read as though I could kind of tell you were saying that you did this or responded to this thing in a way that you probably wouldn't have done it now, but you didn't spend the narcissistic or like arrogant time that I often do when I'm writing to try to over explain. I wouldn't have done this now, but I got the sense. But when I had these conversations, I'm talking about myself. I can read the tea leaves. Like I write something and this is what I did then, and I either have to over explain, or if I don't, someone's going to say, well, you should have. And I fucking know. I know, but this is what I did. You didn't do that. So I guess two things. One, I saw you could sort of see or understand your development as a person as you like throughout the book, like you're sort of reflecting on your own development and understanding of things, and or misunderstanding of things too, whatever it was. You also didn't try to prescribe a certain lifestyle or mindset or anything to anybody. It wasn't like it wasn't a preachy book by any means. It was just reflection, and you held a mirror up to this experience. Did you learn anything from doing this? Did you change your mind about things as you did this? And what's some of the greatest things you learned throughout the process of writing?
I learned so much. I learned that I should have fought and been more aggressive about finding the right kind of treatment for Paul. I not only didn't know all the flaws of the traditional programs, but I didn't think that there were alternatives. I didn't know what I should have known. And so I would do that differently. But also, so I learned that, but I learned things about myself. And it's interesting because you can make a whole outline and you don't learn anything. You're just getting things in sequence. And then you go to fill it in and you think, okay, I see something here that I never would have seen. I don't think I could live to be 100 and I wouldn't have seen it.
Yeah.
And I know, and this has nothing to do with drugs, but I know that I deferred to other people and I would sweep things under the rug sometimes just to keep the group happy.
Yeah.
And that was always my tendency, a peacemaker. And, I've got gumption, so people are complicated. It's not all just one thing or the other, but I would oftentimes turn the other cheek, and I shouldn't have. Because not only did I first figured out that that's what put Paul at risk in certain situations, but also you've got to think as a parent about the modeling too. Because if you always turn the other cheek when somebody does something that's not fair, they say they're coming over and they don't, you say that's okay, and everything's always okay. What you're doing is you're sending the message that your needs are secondary. And people are allowed then to, let you down.
Right.
But you're modeling that behavior for your children. So it struck me, did I not only not protect him to the extent that I could, but did I not model behavior that taught my children to protect themselves? Wow. So, and that's just a sincere question, but it had never occurred to me. I mean, I would tell you I'm easygoing, I'm reasonable, I value getting along more than I value, maybe what I had wanted to do. And I'm not saying I'm selfless, I'm certainly not, but I think I was a little too ready to just do what everybody else wanted to do and to smooth over anything that might have been a friction. Potentially, and not so much with my own children. I'd read them the riot act all the time, and they didn't even take me seriously sometimes. We'd use language that most people probably would frown on, but we all kind of just joked about it. So I'd say, "Oh, Paul, you just go to hell," and he didn't even take me seriously. So I'm not like a wallflower or a pushover, but I think that in a group situation with friends, like my peers, I was the one who didn't exert my needs as readily as others. And maybe that's the personality of the people that you're thrown with that shapes yours too. I don't know. But I realized that I should have been more aware of Paul's being taken advantage of in some situations. And I would turn the other cheek for the sake of harmony with the group. Because I feared if I said, well, I don't think that was right. I mean, there was nothing egregious, but it was the tip of the iceberg. And I didn't want to risk upsetting the apple cart. So I would tend to smooth things over. And I think that's a flaw. And I learned that about myself. I don't know what I'm going to do about it because I'm now in this reclusive life. But
that's like,
and I lost people too as a result of these experiences. So in the end, it's almost ironic, and I didn't dwell on it because I didn't want to. And you know, there are risks when you write a memoir.
Yeah.
But I lost people, and so the ironic thing is that the people that I tried to please, in the end, not only hurt me and my children, but I lost them. So what did I gain? I'm not saying that all falls at my feet. There are different personalities that come into play, but I was asleep at the switch. I was so focused on certain aspects of Paul. I was never lazy or a parent who didn't want to be a parent. But I sometimes did, I think, make my own children secondary along with me. And maybe they just picked up on that. I don't know, but I definitely noticed some things in hindsight that I should have reacted to and I didn't. It's interesting though. You know, parenthood is trailblazing every step of the way.
Yeah.
You know all about 3-year-olds once you have a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
You didn't know all about 3-year-olds when you were going through 3-year-oldhood. So you learn in hindsight, and so there's no way to master it. You're always in a new phase. And again, the consistent thing and the most beneficial thing is that unconditional love. You know, so many other things can go one way or the other, whether you tend to be lenient or tend to be strict, doesn't matter as much as the consistency of that love. So, you know, you can't expect yourself to be perfect, and you sure don't want your kids to try to live up to perfect. You know, that's almost child abuse. But I don't know. I could have paid more attention to certain things, and I was naive in a way, just like I was with the drugs, and I was too much of a peacekeeper.
When it's sort of beautiful that you've come to this realization that in a lot of ways you'd have to wish that people who are parts of the systems that failed your son, that who failed a lot of people and failed you, if only some of them could have realized that or done something about it, realized that you mentioned upsetting the apple cart. It's like, I can't be concerned with like these second order outcomes or potential, you know, down the road consequences because I don't want to upset the apple cart. And you realize that you're not really serving anything. Actually, we're sort of addicted to our own systems.
Exactly.
It's a beautiful realization that so anyone could say, I hear about this when people talk about the cognitive biases and things like that too. Everyone knows that people have biases, and they always talk about that in terms of, oh, these kinds of people have biases. So these idiots with cognitive dissonance, but not me. Carol Tavris wrote a book about it. Mistakes were made, but not by me. It's kind of a beautiful thing that you're able to do that.
And
it's a gift.
Very freeing.
Yeah.
To acknowledge mistakes. To discover them is interesting. Just really interesting. And you ponder it and you put it together and you play with it a little bit before you draw conclusions. And then piece by piece, day by day, it comes together, and then you see it more clearly. And then the next step is you say it. you acknowledge it, you share it with somebody, you know, you write it, whatever. And from start to finish, that's not a 2-day thing, it's weeks, if not months. But it is very freeing because it applies to everything in life. It's not just that situation that I wish I could redo. It is, I'm still here in this world, and here's what I now know that I didn't know before. And I learned it through self-assessment. And maybe I can be a role model for just it, you know, your worst fear realized.
Yeah.
It's sometimes a good thing.
Yeah.
Because you can stuff down what it is you don't want to deal with.
Right.
And you can live your whole life that way. But I believe you will do less good in the world than if you weren't so focused on, it takes a lot of energy to always be accommodating and to always, you know, present in a certain way. And like I said, it is just freeing. You know, and it's not like I stabbed anybody. There's nothing dark-hearted. It's just a weakness that you realize exactly what you said. In the long run, I upset the apple cart already. I set it over a cliff instead of just knocking off a wheel. It's gone.
Yeah.
It crashed and burned.
So you don't have to worry about that apple cart anymore. Yeah.
I mean, so yes, so it's just so interesting, and you could apply it to so many things in life, and you know, in everybody's life, I think. So I just hope that, you know, and a part of me has to laugh too. I think, you know, I get on my soapbox and I think, who would listen to me? My child was addicted to drugs and died. Yeah. So here I come to give you the message of, you know, what I know that I want to share with you. And honestly, I do. I laugh out loud. I think, you're the last person. They want to talk to the parent of the boy who's, you know, a physician now and, you know, a heart surgeon saving lives. Why do they want to listen to you? But I'm kidding, because most people really don't think that way. They think you had an experience and they're interested in it. And then because they're interested in it, the byproduct is they might learn something.
Yes.
But I can get pretty preachy about something.
Well, no. That's you're the opposite. You're the opposite of that. You really are. Because how can you tell? I could never tell this to a person who lost a child. Say, there's all of the merit to someone having lost a child, and there are stories and experiences associated with that are truths to those people that you can never take away. But at the moment that person tries to extrapolate from that experience to say this is what everyone should do, or this is the right, and it's wrong, that's almost like an unquestionable, and like you say, but you can't really ask the question, well, didn't it not work for you, or something like that. That's like a heinous thing to say. So you just have to kind of opt out of the conversation. Unfortunately, you did this. It's what you're doing is not that. Like I said before, you're not preaching something, and actually I kind of need people like you to tell this story in order for things that I think to make sense, because like Stanton and I talk about trauma theory, and what you just said, it encapsulates what we believe about it perfectly. Like, you would not prescribe trauma to someone. You wouldn't say, you know, you're having a hard time, you know, what you need is some trauma, because that usually makes things better. Never. I mean, there's a total there's a problem with that forward moving sort of prognosis. But you can say, if you've had bad past experiences like you talked about with Paul and yourself, there's a sort of interesting advantage to, you know, understanding that the world is not as stable as you may have it pinned to be, or may feel like you need it to be. And then also you know, to use the worst of your experiences and maybe the worst of your own behaviors, you know, mistakes that you've made in the past, to say, oh, I don't have to just like spin my wheels about all the things that I could have done. I can say, these are things I can do right now, and I'm learning from the past. And that's like the most valuable, amazing, life enhancing sort of a lesson and mindset that someone could take. Not everyone really, I don't know that everyone's willing to take that on, or I'm not certain everyone has the capacity to be able to do it. But that is always what I'm saying, is that if you can tolerate looking at the past and mapping that on to the present and the future to make it better, that's such an amazing way forward. And it's not to say don't worry about the past or something like that.
No, it's not saying that. But again, I find some parents too are just who've lost people. Everything is about their grief.
Yeah.
And every post is about, oh, Billy forever. Billy's tattooed on my arm. Not to say that would be a bad thing, but Billy was perfect, and Billy and I, and every year, oh, it's Billy's birthday. And I think you neglected Billy. I can just tell. Because the people who have to wear it on their sleeve like that, death is a bad thing, but death and guilt together is so much worse.
Wow.
So I know that. And so the ones who just, oh, I don't know how I'm ever going to put one foot in front of the other. And it's been 3 years. And I mean, you better, get started. It's high time.
Yeah.
You can't rewind. You would cut off your right arm to rewind. A mother would give her life to give the child his life back. But that's not an option. So again, this precious thing that you still have, let's lift yourself up and do something with it. The human spirit is amazing, but I do find that guilt can wreak havoc with your ability to cope with grief, because it's twisted. It's all so twisted. It's not pure grief. And so I noticed that with parents, and some people who have pushed back with me. I said that, sometimes, and I know that Stanton, I think I know, doesn't like people to be told, well, of course, what was your trauma the minute they sit down, because that's loading them up almost like, you have a disease and you obviously had a trauma.
Let's find the trauma and extract it. Yeah.
We'll find it. Yeah. So I know that, but I have said before that Paul's experiences were a harbinger for falling into addiction, and that maybe special educators and people that work with people with disabilities should just be aware of some of those tendencies and some of those connections.
For sure.
And this one woman shot back at me, because it was some blog I had written, or maybe it was an op-ed, but she said, I feel bad enough that I lost my son, and now you're telling me he had trauma? You're telling me I did something wrong? And I thought, first of all, lady, I'm not telling you anything. I'm just expressing myself, and I don't know you. But I said, no, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that sometimes an unfortunate childhood experience can lead to this kind of a choice, and one that you can't pull out of, because a lot of people, use highly addictive drugs and walk away, even after chaotic use. I said, that's all I'm saying. Well, I already feel bad enough, and I just don't like thinking there was anything went wrong in his childhood. Nothing went wrong in his childhood. So, I don't know, maybe that's true. But when you're that quick, that knee-jerk reaction, it feels to me like a defensiveness.
It well. I remember you talking about having that sort of experience. Earlier on in the conversation, you were sort of talking about having that, it wasn't saying trauma, but it was like Paul has a developmental delay or something like that. And
oh yeah, no, I didn't want to go there.
Yeah.
So no, I mean, it is. That's why I had so much patience for parents when teachers would say, oh, that mother, she's just denying that he has a problem. And I'd say, I understand that.
Yeah.
She'll come along.
Yeah.
She'll come along. It's a process. There's a point where you have to hit her over the head with it. But you just have patience for people when you've been in a similar situation.
Yeah, this is one of the most real conversations I've had on this podcast, the most valuable and real, I don't know what I'm trying to say, honest conversations that I've had on this podcast. And
well, that's wonderful to hear, because I'm so impressed. I'm not just trying to, schmooze with you, but I think you're a really good interviewer, and you're able to talk to anybody, the variety of people and I've heard somebody say something and then you say, are you saying this? And you're not telling them, you're just trying to tease it apart and get to it. So you're rewording it to say, is that what you're saying? And you said it better than he did. And he said, yeah, that is what I'm saying. And I think you're really sensitive and tuned into people, and a gifted interviewer. It's no wonder you've fallen into this, because you're really good at it.
I appreciate that. Well, I think people are interesting. I've always thought that, if you're having a conversation with somebody and you're bored, you're not really listening to them, because people are just so interesting. It's just not, something's going wrong with the conversation if it's not the right context or not the right thing.
Interesting if they're just saying, I've done everything right and I was a really good mother and I have no regrets. And
yeah, that's true.
It's not so interesting.
That's true. I guess there's a reason why. What's it called? The new, if it bleeds, it leads kind of news stories. That's why. Yeah. So we've gone more than 2 hours, and you deserve that time, and
you're very sweet. Your wife and daughter deserve some time too.
Yeah, I have to map. We always map that out too. So in one sense, my wife is amazing, and so we just work everything out that she and I want to do. We make it work, but she knows that I need these involvements and deep conversations. Sometimes I'll try to, my thoughts exploding, sort of like Paul's, and not having an outlet for them. When I don't have that outlet, she is the only one left for, to receive all of this stuff, and she tries, and so she knows I need it. So anyway, I digress. But I want to leave one last thing before I just talk about your book one more time and tell everyone that they should buy it, because it's a gift to me, and this conversation was too. Since I have you, and since we were getting so close to this, you were talking about, you see the parents who have lost a child, and no one's really allowed. It would be such a faux pas to say you should stop just always bringing this up all the time, or talking about all the grief all the time. Maybe, lift your gaze a little bit. You can't say that, but you sort of have the right of way to at least be bringing it up now. What advice do you have? Because I know that you have to know this feeling, like the desire to want to do this. What advice do you have to someone who feels bogged down by those emotions and can't seem to take the sort of more stoic or thought-provoking perspective you did?
It depends on my incentive to help them.
Yeah.
And my opportunity to become familiar, because the people who are just go to the gravesite every day and post the roses and with them every birthday, and I don't have a lot of patience for that, because I don't think it's anywhere near honest enough for me to make a difference. And that sounds so harsh, but there are a few of those people.
Do you feel like that's disrespectful to that person that they're grieving to do that?
Yeah, probably. It's me talking out of both sides of my mouth, because I'm saying, why don't people just listen and understand? But I don't feel I'll be effective with somebody who is so driven by making sure that how close he was to that child, and how much they did together, and how very painful this is, and how, it's Billy forever, and Billy. And I just think maybe next year we'd be able to talk. But I have experiences to answer your questions. There's a woman who I'm crazy about, and I just met her last year. She contacted me. Her son died just in November. And she has had a very hard year. She is a very kind person. She has a sense of humor. I've been in her company 3 times now. She'll laugh. She finds her job to be a great escape. She's a good-hearted person, but she's suffering mightily because she misses him and she loved him, and she's upset that, you know, she misses him. And so I've said to her, it's just time and you can't rush it. You know, you will find a better footing because you have too much going for you and too many people who love you. I can just tell you're going to find a footing. And she has expressed interest in a couple of harm reduction initiatives. And so, you know, I don't expect it. I don't say, you know, Thursday, and I don't even always tell her. I just feel protective of her in a way, but I see her as a person who will, you know, she bought my book and I said, oh, I didn't even tell you about it because I didn't want you to have to.
I know that feeling.
No,
I know
it's
that
too,
feeling. Yeah,
it's too raw for you now. So that, and she said, oh no, I really want to read it. This is how sweet she is. She sent me a Facebook message, you know, a private message after that. And she said, I know you so well now. And I can tell you that I love you. And I said, you know what? I love you too. And so we spent August 31st together because that's Overdose Awareness Day. And we didn't do a damn thing to improve the world. We sat on her deck and had, not mojitos, something cool. I can't even think, margaritas. That's not the drink. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It was a drink. But she said, I make a mean, oh, it's a popular, crushes. That's what we had, crushes. So, you know, I could feel a little guilty, but that's what we did. And I wanted to be with her and she wanted to be with me. And we had a couple cocktails and sat on her deck. So I think that she'll move on and do, you know, take her experiences and convert it into some good, you know, but everybody's different and you have to respect that too. I don't expect her to, you know, where you have to write a book and then you have to, you know, it's not prescribed, but I can just tell that I'm probably a good person for her to know, but she's a good person for me to know. And she reminds me of how very painful it is. And so it's just a terrible thing. And you know, and part of you is angry because it shouldn't have happened. These deaths are preventable.
Yeah.
I had a woman write to me today and she wrote through my website and said, I lost my son in September. And she said, I'm just heartbroken. And I listened to part of one of your podcasts. She said, and I'm very interested in your book. And so, you know, I wrote her back and I don't know whether that will be the end of that, but for the people that I can help, I would have really liked is to have some role where I could talk to people whose children were in the throes of active addiction, because I think I could be helpful. I think I could be helpful.
I know what you mean. Because I like the book, right? And podcasting too. I know that feeling of like, it reminds me of like Voyager, and they sent like Beatles music and hopefully they're finding another, you know, hospitable planet, you know, for life, and maybe they'll see it. I kind of feel like that sometimes. Like I have something valuable to say, so I'll just put it out there, or I'll just write this, and maybe someone will find it. And it sounds like people have found it, but I know what you mean, that you'd like to do that more actively. Like, how can you better the world in a very active way?
Yeah, I'd like to have it, and I am on more committees than I should have taken on.
Yeah.
You know, I'm on the People's Commission to Decriminalize Marijuana.
Those things kind of pop up, don't they?
And on and on. And then I'll say, I'm dropping out of something. And I tend to not be as attentive to the ones that I don't think are going to make a difference. And there are a lot of people around here who mean well, but who just aren't ready to change their thinking, and they're very dug in about it. And so I'm not as active with some of those groups, but then I think, well, I should be more active with them because I need to, you know, gradually try to be an influence. I think I can do that. It's just I have to pick and choose, and I've gotten myself so busy, and I wake up in the morning and I feel guilty that I didn't do this, and I've got this meeting, and I could have read this before, and I think no one's paying you.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm thinking, oh yikes, I've got to. So I've taken on more than I sometimes feel like I can't do any of it well.
I see. I know what you mean. I know exactly what you mean.
I have to be a little more shrewd with doing some things well and letting go of some others, but at the same time, I hope to get catapulted into a more, not like a job per se, but a role where I would talk with people that are in some sort of treatment facility or something, just to give them a different perspective and to give them, you know, a resource. That's all. A resource.
I want people to hear that Jessie Dunleavy wants, you know, one of those valuable jobs, not that stupid ass cannabis legalization thing, but like a real. I really, really appreciate everything you're doing that I know about. Maybe I don't appreciate some of the things I don't know about, but I don't know about them. And thanks for your time.
I tend to stuff those down, you know.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. I can keep quiet. And I really appreciate the conversation tonight. I didn't expect it to go as long as it did or to go the way it did. I was trying to do better about this lately and not have anything scripted or, you know, ready. So I just read the book and was ready to talk to you, and it was awesome. I think it's going to be super valuable to people. And I want to.
Well, no, and I like the free flowing conversation because you don't know where it's going to go, but it's more real. And I know as a listener, I can get engaged in something where you sense that you're just a fly on the wall instead of here were the questions and I answered them ahead of time.
Yes.
And, you know, so I again, as a listener, I appreciate that. Good. But I am like you, I'm interested in people and I'm interested in their perspective. And I was very interested in, and I don't want to prolong this, that man who goes out on the street and talks to people.
Yeah, Anthony Magnabosco.
Yes.
What a weird thing to do. So awesome and amazing.
And then I saw him actually doing it.
Yeah.
How did I do that? I don't even know how I got to there. I saw him on the street, like talking. He just stopped somebody. It was like a college campus or something.
Oh, you actually saw him in person doing it?
I saw him. Well, I mean, not in person. I saw him on.
Oh, okay. I got you.
Yeah, but I mean, so I heard his conversation with you, and then I saw him out there, and he'd say, you know, could I ask you a question? And I, okay, this is the guy. There he goes.
Yeah.
So anyways, interesting.
The book is called Cover My Dreams in Ink. And there, now I got it this time, right? Now you can see the whole thing. I guess it was Jessie Dunleavy. And can you tell people where to access your, I know you have a website and probably other ways to get a hold of you.
I do have a website. And my website's jessiedunleavy.com. And that's DUNLEAVY. And also the book is available on all of the major retail sites. Some I didn't even know about, but Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and but they're all on the website. You know, there's a button to each one of the Books A Million, Indie Books, Bookshop. So all the little competitors that you feel good about.
You can go to the mom and pop shops too.
Yeah. And then here in Annapolis, where I live, it's in a couple of local bookstores, but otherwise it hasn't gone very far and wide, but it is online and easy to access.
It's worth the read. We've probably gone long enough to be like an audiobook, but it's not, we didn't capture every interesting thing about the book. So it's still worth reading. So I recommend that people do it and visit your site. Thank you so much again for talking to me.
Yep. I'll look forward to talking to you again.